Welcome to the next session of the National Press Foundation's America's Long-Term Care Crisis Journalism Fellowship. We've just had a really strong conversation about issues of equity and access when it comes to families receiving the supports and services that they need to provide long-term care. This next conversation will build on that discussion because we're going to be talking about the intersectionality of long-term care. And for many of you journalists who know about the issue of intersectionality, you know that essentially what it means is that many of the social issues that we write about, or certainly the challenges that we report on, hit different, as they say, when it comes to communities of color. They are impacted by layers upon layers of different aspects of the issue. And so for this discussion, we're very privileged to have Karyne Jones. She's the president and CEO of the National Caucus and Center on Black Aging. I've found in the past few months that every other organization that we work with or we've had Zooms with or whatever, someone always says, well, we were just talking to Karyne Jones about this topic. So Karyne stays busy. We can, I think, draw that conclusion. But Karyne is here to also give us some high-level context on what we need to consider when we're reporting on the issue of intersectionality as it applies to long-term care. So Karyne, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I'd like for you to start by just giving us some background on who you are and your career, and then bring us up to your joining the National Caucus.
Well, first of all, it is very good to be here. If I tell you everything that I've done, you'll think I just can't stay employed. But that's not the case. I have just had wonderful opportunities in my career. I'm originally from San Antonio, Texas, born and raised. Had wonderful parents who made sure that not only did we get our educations, my siblings and I, but also to make sure that we had a responsibility and an obligation to give back to the community. So I have early memories of my parents who did a lot of volunteering in their church and in other organizations, and them dragging us along and making us do whatever the older people didn't want to do, they made us do, but we were contributing and giving back to our communities. So with that foundation, went away to college, Clark Atlanta, in Atlanta, Georgia, and left there, the big part. While I was there, my first week on campus, I didn't know anybody. There was a young minister, and I'm going to really date myself. It was a young minister walking around trying to recruit students to come and work in his congressional campaign. He was going to try to become the first African-American congressman since Reconstruction out of Georgia. And that young minister was Andrew Young. And so I had heard about him because, you know, I grew up in San Antonio, which was not the hub of civil rights movement, but I had watched it, been on TV, watched the whole civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, the whole thing. So that's one of the reasons I chose Atlanta, because I wanted to get there and be where all the action seemed to be back in those days. And so I joined his campaign and worked very hard and met a whole lot of people. And as a result of that, he had me to come and work in his district office. After I finished all my classes, I would go to his office in the afternoon. And so I always tell him when I see him how he changed my life in that I didn't get to be a part of the actual civil rights movement, but because of who he was, all of those civil rights workers used to come through the office, and I used to hear and listen to their stories. And it was almost as if I could relive what they'd been to, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, they made jokes about being in jail, and so it was amazing, though. But that's how I hooked up with him. And then when I graduated, I went away. I got a master's degree in public affairs from Northern Illinois University. Went there because I got a full scholarship. Never did think about going to DeKalb, Illinois, but you know, you got a full ride. My parents told me I had no choice. And went there, got my master's. And my last semester, you were required to do an internship. And Andy made arrangements for me to come back to Atlanta. And I worked in the Jimmy Carter for President campaign. Now, I'm telling you, I'm really dating myself because he just celebrated his 99th birthday. And I did that, and then as soon as that was over, my internship was over, Andy had me to come and work in his Washington office, and so that's how I got to Washington the first time. I hope I'm not going too long on myself.
You know, what you're doing here actually is giving us a really good insight into your civil rights and sort of the equity access. So what I'm going to do is ask you, the journalist to read your bio and learn more about you that way.
Yeah, there you go.
But bring us up to the National Center, the National Caucus.
Okay, so after all of that, and also I went back to Texas. Well, I have to tell you, I worked in his district office. Then he went to the UN. I went with him to the United Nations. Wow. I was his public affairs officer there. And then when he decided to go back to Atlanta and become mayor, run for mayor, I decided, by that time I was married and expecting my first child, went back to Texas. There I started my own political career. I was in the state legislature for almost 10 years. And really got involved more on issues on a political basis. When the Tea Party kind of started coming into action, I felt like our work was wasn't being as effective. And I was asked to come and join SBC Communications, which is now AT&T. So I called a press conference, resigned from the legislature, and came back to Washington as a lobbyist. And I lobbied for them for 5 years. While I was a lobbyist, I met my predecessor, Samuel Simmons, who was president and CEO of NCBA, National Caucus and Center on Black Aging. And he asked me to join the board. And I joined the board, and for 3 years I served on the board. My travel schedule got crazy. I resigned from the board. He decided to retire. A year later, he asked me to come back, serve on the Presidential Search Committee. And if you know the history of Dick Cheney, who helped with that and then decided to become vice president, I pulled a Dick Cheney, resigned from the Presidential Search Committee, submitted my resume, and I was unanimously voted by the board 20 years ago to become their CEO, and I've been doing that ever since.
You know, two things come to mind hearing you discuss this. One, you've got terrific timing. Apparently, you just know when to pack up and move on.
Very blessed.
The second one, though, which I really find interesting, is all of our discussions that we've had around federal versus state when it comes to actually getting things done and policy, et cetera. And so I find it really interesting and admirable that you chose to focus all of your experience and expertise from a policy perspective on this issue. So tell us more about that.
So I used to talk about them and they. Now I talk about we in my discussions. Aging with grace and understanding now exactly what older people go through, especially older people of color. I know most of you have never heard of the National Caucus and Center on Black Aging. We've been around for 53 years. We were founded by African American nursing home professionals back in the late 60s who wanted to make sure that the legislation that was being evolved, the Older Americans Act, included communities of color because as you well know, I hope you know, the Older Americans Act is where all of the programs and services for older adults in this country are housed. And so it's a very important piece of legislation to make sure that our older adults age in dignity and with as much care as possible. And so they got involved in that, got a seat at the table, and made sure that communities of color were not left out. As a result of their success in that advocacy, they founded this organization, and we've been in existence ever since. What we do is we, of course, do health and wellness programs. We do training and employment for low-income seniors to help them find jobs. We own and manage and help other nonprofits and churches develop senior affordable housing. We just closed last week on a new $160 million property here in Columbia Heights in Washington. It's 179 independent senior living, affordable senior living here in the district. And we're very proud of this property because we've set aside 40 of those apartments for grand families. Grand families are grandparents or relative kinship families that are raising their grandchildren. And if you know the way the system works, if you're in an affordable senior facility, you cannot have your children there. They can visit, but they can't live there. And so what happens in the case of an older person who has to assume the responsibility of a young child, they get thrown then into that multifamily situation, which you know is a disaster. And you can imagine being 75 with a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old and being in that predicament. So we're trying to encourage as many housing developers like ourselves and others that when they do build these senior housing affordable places, which we need more and more and more of, that they also set aside those apartments for this particular population. So that's what NCBA does. And of course, we're advocates. We are always on the Hill about Medicare, Social Security, any and everything related to older people. And of course, with the emphasis on ensuring that people of color, older adults, are considered in that process.
So you just touched on one of the key issues, intersectional issues for communities of color, and that's access to housing. Give the journalist a sort of primer on what the key ways, the layers of intersectionality when it comes to long-term care and providing supports.
Well, you almost can't talk about intersectionality without understanding what the term is. And so I would hope that you all have heard of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the person who's credited. She is a legal scholar and a civil rights advocate, currently I think a UCLA professor, who came up with the term some years ago that really tried to explain how all of the social determinants and all of the inequality, racism, discrimination, all impact every aspect of life for people of color. They go hand in hand. It's historical policies that continue to exist. It's societal attitudes that continue to think of people differently. And here we are still in 2023 grappling with the fact that not all Americans have access to quality health care, to quality housing, affordable housing, employment opportunities, just all of the basic needs of your own humanity that you want to see a person do. And if you're older, you want to see people age in dignity. It's very difficult to do that if they've had a lifetime of dealing with challenges and barriers simply because of their race, their zip code, their ethnicity, what have you. So when we talk about intersectionality, that's what we're talking about, how things go hand in hand. Why you may have poor health for someone older as a result of all of these other issues along the way, and what's required for them in the ends of their lives with long-term care and why it still exists. racism, discrimination just go hand in hand with the way the policies are developed.
We talked about the fact that I really want you to provide us with the insight we need about the workforce issue. I believe that providing a path to a professional career, wages that allow you to raise your family and feed your family even, are so important in this issue because the workforce has been seen to be Black and brown women who are going to do it anyway, and there's always going to be plenty of them who need it. So let's hear your take on what that would mean for communities.
So first of all, because I want to make it real clear, that 99% of the people who come to us, and of course we were founded on looking out and focusing on African American seniors and also persons of African descent. We were founded on that premise, and that's our mission. However, we help poor people of any race because they pretty much share the same problems and challenges. What we find out, and I always want to make it clear to everybody, particularly when you're writing, the people who come to us finally for some assistance, they've worked all their lives. They've raised their families. They've contributed to their communities. And as a result of different barriers and challenges along the way, as they have aged, they have poor health, poor housing options, poor opportunities for education, and obviously finding the kind of job that would help support them. But some way, somehow, throughout their lives, they have still contributed. And I don't want anybody to ever think that just because someone when they've gotten older, that they haven't done anything. And this is why they're in those circumstances. No. Every one of them comes in there with interesting stories about their lives and how they've not only taken care of themselves, their families, but their communities and other people's children and what have you. Good people. So as long as we have that understanding, we're not dealing with derelicts. We're dealing with some really good citizens and good Americans. But what we find, particularly in our training and employment program, is when they do come to us, and because there has been a lack of educational opportunities and a lack for opportunities for really good employment, we also find that if you've worked as a domestic or you worked and you've just been paid cash or what have you don't have Social Security, you don't have that. I mean, there's all kinds of barriers that are put in place. We still can identify their skills. If a woman comes in who has never worked, she stayed at home, she took care of the family, she was the one that was responsible budgeting, making sure there was money for food, rent, whatever was there. Husband dies or gets sick, and there she is, and she said, well, I have never done anything, I've just always been a homemaker. We point out to her, if you have been able to maneuver and keep your family going all this, you've got skills. And so we do a lot of psychology work too, and encouragement with people who already come in thinking that nothing's going to help me, or maybe you can help me. But when we get them, we identify their skills, we get them trained, we find host agencies, which are usually nonprofits, educational institutions, and some corporations. Some of our biggest supporters are CVS, Home Depot, some of these others who hire our older adults, and we have so many wonderful success stories where they go in, they work harder than any 18, 20-year-old will, and they move up in the organizations, and those are our success stories. And if it's not for health reasons, or if they have to leave for caregiving reasons, they have a successful career later in life. And that's what's really all about. I just have never met anybody who wants to be poor. And if they do, there's something else going on there in the mental health area. But
one of the most heart-wrenching things for me is to see the older woman, late 60s, early 70s, still providing these caregiving services for families.
Oh, yeah.
But the minute they need them, there's nothing there. And their families are plunged into a nightmare.
Yeah, and we don't, obviously, we aren't involved in long-term care, but we get thousands of calls annually from people who are thrown into those situations, who are calling about, I now have to take care of my family member. I have to quit my job because there's no one else to do it. And so we try to gear them to the right place where they can get some sort of resources and support. The saddest calls we get are from people who are in the hospital and know now that they can't live alone, that they are going to require care, and they aren't eligible for any of, they don't have insurance, they don't have any savings, they don't have, what do I do? Where do I go? Who do I have? So we really try to help them, and again, it's out of our bounds, but our commitment and our mission of our organization is to improve the quality of life of older adults, and so we do everything we can to assist them at least getting on a path. It's still very difficult because we know the resources are not as available. The support mechanisms are not available. And you're absolutely right. Caregiving is hard. It is hard work. And our country does not value what caregivers provide in terms of what is not costing this economy. I mean, I have the numbers with me, but I think it's like they do over 30 billion hours a year just in this country in taking care of family members or relative, whatever the case may be, and it saves so much money in them not having to be in assisted living or nursing homes. And it just seems to me, if we would get more progressive in this country and say, boy, if we had just invested more in some preventive health issues, some of these people wouldn't be in the position where they would need caregiving, but also recognize that those who do care for others need some kind of break, some kind of assistance. I don't remember the number, and I'm sorry, I have it somewhere written here, but caregivers sometimes die before the person they're caring for. So it is difficult. And I tell you, I've got a 97-year-old mother. I've been very, very fortunate that she was able to live independently until 3 weeks ago when she fell. And so when you did call me last week and I didn't call you back, I was in the middle of trying to find a place for her. But fortunately, she has the resources. We were able to do that. I think about all of the people who don't. And it particularly affects communities of color as a result of all the intersections and the reason a lifetime of having to deal with the discrimination that goes around with just being Black.
I want to drill a bit deeper on the issue of culture, background, ethnic background in this discussion, because one of our speakers earlier brought to mind something that I knew, I guess, but I didn't really think about deeply, and that is so many people of color caregivers deal with racism from the people they're caring for. And the flip side is when you're caring for a person of color who's dealing with dementia, Alzheimer's, etc., things like the fact that they may want collard greens every now and then. And if the caregiver isn't oriented to that or doesn't consider that as an important need on their part, or the nursing facility that they're in doesn't have that. So talk a little bit more about what that means in this discussion.
Well, we unfortunately in this country still don't value our differences and our diversity, which is really the beauty of our country. I mean, if we were all just the same, it would be so boring. I mean, I like the fact that everybody has on different colors and everybody seems to come from different ethnic. I mean, that's the greatness of this, and we should draw from our strength. Unfortunately and historically, and unfortunately systematically, that's not how we address a lot of issues. And it is very difficult if there is no cultural competency or even an attempt to understand that somebody might want rice and beans, that they haven't lost who they are and their identity just because they've moved into a situation where they need more assistance. I would say, though, particularly, I can only really speak on, and I don't speak on behalf, but I speak on just basically knowing that I've worked with many, many Black people, is that when they are caregivers, obviously, they understand that. I tell you what I don't understand is when you have a caregiver who is caring for your loved one and you don't want to pay them a living wage. They're caring for your loved one. They are making sure that person is clean and fed and entertained and actually extending their life and the quality of their life. And people still don't want to pay them a living wage.
Well, that gets to the perception of this inexhaustible workforce.
Yeah.
There's just millions and millions of poor Black and brown women who can fill the bill.
Yeah, and we have people who call us thinking that we're kind of a referral thing. But you know anybody who can come and take care of my mother? Well, no, but there are services, and we, refer them. We try to help anybody who calls with anything if we don't have the information. And, and they said, but how much do you pay? Well, that's something you'll have to discuss with them. But we always say, but we hope you'll be fair. We hope you'll be fair. So, yeah, we have a long way. I mean, like I said, we're still dealing with, does everybody have a right to access to health care in this country? We still put a value on life. Some lives matter more than others. But we're still grappling with, people are still mad about the Affordable Care Act. Now, there hadn't been anybody who's tried to change that. I mean, all the horrible things that have been said about it. But why would you want to change something where it provided millions of people an opportunity to health care and not even provide an alternative?
Well, then, before I open it up for the journalists to ask questions, let's talk about this issue of where the momentum or the action even begins to occur. Because as we've heard repeatedly, competing interests are what keep sound, rational policies from being developed. So what looks like common sense when it comes to having a humane, caring society, if there's an industry that won't benefit from it financially, they'll spend more money blocking it than they could. So with your background in policy and lobbying and understanding these processes, how do you move hearts and minds, or do you even think about moving hearts on this particular issue of long-term care?
Well, you come to events like this and you talk to people and you try to really reach their own humanity. And you try to remind them that we're not so different. We're more alike than different. We all come from different backgrounds and ethnicities and all of the other religions, everything. But basically, I try to appeal to people's humanity. We cannot in this country, we're going to implode if we don't stop not liking people or feeling that somebody is getting more because they have to access services to help them. We got to get over that. This is the only country in the Western civilization that I know of that doesn't honor their older adults, their elders. I know it's scary for you young people, but you're gonna get there. You're going to get there. And as I told you in the beginning, I used to, when I first came into this job, talked about them and they and everything. And now it's we, because I am so much a part of it. I just turned 70 years old. I have 10 grandchildren. And I'm doing all I can in my remaining working days, which I hope go on for quite some time. I am just appalled at the ageism rhetoric that's going on right now. Everybody who is of a certain age, and if they've been blessed with good health and opportunities and a life that gives them a chance to really do well, you can be 90 years old and still be as productive and contributing in our shared community. And so I always take these opportunities, particularly with you young journalists who will really influence so many people on how they think. You have a very, very strong and important role in changing the attitudes in this country. And it's going to take a whole lot of hard work, because we have a lot of folks out there who are just afraid of the changing demographics. I always try to tell people, and particularly when I go, because I speak to groups that'll be all white, and I try to tell them, you know, equity does not mean I'm gonna take something from you and give it to somebody else. It means just that, an equal opportunity to have this and that and what have you. It's not taking away. And you can't get people to understand that if you invest in people early, give them a good education or a good training, a good skill, if you provide them with preventive health services, if you make sure that they can live in safe areas, in communities, that they then become contributing citizens and not the burden you have this perception or this bias that they will be.
I'm going to press you even further on this, because we almost had the government shut down because people are the competing interests thing. So it's one thing to have these discussions in town hall meetings and journalists writing stories that the public can read. But what about in those halls of Congress? When a vote for something that seems like common sense and again, humane, the congressman is saying, I won't vote for it because the folks who donated the most to me don't want me to. So how do we circumvent that? Or
well, I can tell you from when I worked on the Hill, things are completely different now. They don't even speak to each other if you're from, it's just totally different. I can remember even when I was lobbying, you see Democrats and Republicans going out to dinner, they do family vacations. It wasn't this partisanship that's just so in place now. And I will admit, when I was in the legislature, sometimes somebody would go up to speak, to talk about their bill, and I wouldn't even know what the bill was about, but if I didn't like them, I voted no. And that's terrible. As a matter of fact, one time I saw this one guy and I hated him. He was nasty, he was ugly, he was, sexual harassment was not as common back in the late 80s and 90s as it is now, but he'd say horrible, nasty things. And in Texas, they don't do it now, but back then they used to allow you, a lot of those guys dip snuff, chew tobacco, and they'd have the cups on their desk, and you'd go to talk to them, and I don't know if I want to do that or not, and oh God, it was just, he was disgusting. And I saw him up there talking, and so when it came to vote, I voted no. And one of my friends came and said, no, Karyne, that's a good bill. That's a good bill. What's it about? And he told me, I said, oh, okay. And then I switched over. I said, well, see. So I made that in jest, but that's unfortunately a little bit of kind of what's going on. It's almost like you have to go the line and you can't cross over. We're going to see what happens with the speakership thing. If there's going to be some crossing over, we will see. There are just as many Democrats who say they don't care if the speaker goes or not. So that they'll be voting, yeah, get rid of him. So we don't know. But it's not the same. The atmosphere is horrible. And I just can't imagine that most Americans want that kind of society. And that's why, again, what people read, what they're seeing on TV, they're not distinguishing between facts and opinion. That's going to be very important for you moving forward to make sure, the facts are the facts. The opinions, what do they say? Everybody got one,
Opinions and other things. Let's open it up for questions now. Does anyone have a question for Karyne? Let's come over here.
By the way, that legislator's dead now.
One final jab.
Yeah, he's dead. I remember one time his mother came and she was.
I
know it. I just remembered him. I had forgotten about him. His mother was up in the gallery, and he got on the podium and said, "I just want everybody to welcome my mother to the floor and blah, 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 and everything." He had a mother?
Burn. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Emily Schabacher. I'm with the Billings Gazette, and I'm from Montana.
Okay.
In Montana, we have a really large population of indigenous people. We have 12 tribes and 7 reservations. And this intersectionality of long-term care is a very prominent issue. We have LPNs who want to become RNs, but then there's an issue with broadband access. And of course, it's a very economically depressed area on the reservations. And I think legislators often feel like it is too big of an issue. There are too many things to tackle. So from a policy perspective, how do we approach this with legislators, and how do we act on solutions-based journalism to encourage them to take some action?
Well, first of all, Emily, Montana's not different from many other states that grapple with those kinds of things, and not just with indigenous people, but wherever there's large populations of people of color, there's always that issue. All I can say is, again, it is what information people are getting so that they can get their hearts and minds right. And I don't want to sound hokey about that, but at some point we still do have to appeal to people's own sense of understanding that everyone has human value. And so the way, of course, I would address it is to make sure that policymakers, legislators understand, and I know it's very difficult to do, but they're our chosen leaders. They're the people we elect to represent communities. And we've got to elect people who understand that not investing in people continues to burden everybody. If you don't want to pay for people to get nutrition assistance and to have access to all the other health services and all that stuff, you got to invest in the preventive things so that cost down the road is not as hard. And we just have to elect people that understand that. Not elect people who are on a vendetta, people who just obviously show hatred for other people. And I know that's hard sometimes because they want to represent their constituencies, and if their constituencies feel that way, they want to stay in office, and so power and position means more to them than actually going and doing something great for the state. And We just try to encourage as many people of color to run for office and to get the message out. We try to encourage as many people to register to vote and not be discouraged by things that don't work. It may not work this time, but maybe the next time it might pass. Maybe not that time, but you never give up and hopefully move forward. And you, in writing for the newspaper, I hope are not dissuaded by editors who say, maybe you shouldn't put this in, if you know it's a fact and that you've done your research to document it. Because that happens, as you well know. And I know you only have just a little bitty section, so many words and all of that. Make those words the most powerful so that people who read what you've written can see in their own hearts how we have to change things in this country in order to be the best country we all claim we want it to be.
I want to follow up on, Emily, that question, because the issue of misinformation when it comes to different people of color communities or patented attempts to keep people from getting the information they need or spreading tales or stories about, well, the Native American, the indigenous population will take care of themselves, or they don't want our help, or whatever.
Well, they don't. But unfortunately, they set up a system where they now need to. But they don't.
Point.
I don't know any people who want to get help. They only go there because they have to. So now you're dealing with implicit and explicit biases. And let me just tell you, everybody has biases. We are products of our environment. There are things that I learned when I was young from the environment that I was in about white people. There are things that white people or other ethnicities learned about black people, and that's ingrained. So what we have to try to do is make sure we're conscious of something that might be a bias that may not be true. And the one thing we also have to remember that no set, no group, no race is monolithic. Everybody is different. The worst compliment you can ever give, particularly to a black person, is, well, you're different. Different from what? Meaning, oh, well, you're articulate. What does that mean? Because I've had opportunities for education, because I've had exposure and what have you. Hey, I wish everybody could. Not just black people, but everybody. So we got to really be conscious of all our implicit biases, because there's enough explicit bias that we know it's already in our policies and in our societal attitudes. So, yeah.
Well, you bring to mind then another issue, which is mental health supports for families and communities when it comes to this. Respite care, things that allow people to continue providing these supports. Talk about that in terms of the intersectional issue.
Well, again, it all goes to the importance of caregivers and how they need resources in order to continue to care for their loved ones, so that it doesn't put a burden on the rest of society to have to figure out the cost, not only the economic cost, but the human cost of having people who need more resources for support, so they can at least live their life in some, with dignity. We don't understand. I just don't. Well, they know. It's just that everybody's bound by their politics. You cannot not invest in people to be the best they can be. When you don't, this is when you have all these problems. So now we're all hyped up about mental health because of all these shootings. And, I hated that guy in the lecture, but I didn't want to shoot him, We all have those moments where something clicks with people, and we just do not have enough mental health services, young and old, to address the growing need in this country. And it comes from isolation, it comes from bullying, it comes from people feeling inadequate, it comes from people not feeling that they're a contributing part or a shared part of a community. How do we get to those people so they don't get to destructive issues? And again, it's going to take resources and investment in their human value. So.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Jessie with CQ Roll Call. I think we actually went through the same grad school program.
Ah,
UIS?
yes.
Yeah. I was interested in what you were saying about after your mom fell and you had to get care for her. What was that process like to find and vet a place that you knew they were doing good care? And like, how long did it take to go through that process, especially as someone who's probably used to like navigating these kinds of systems?
Yeah.
I'm sure it still wasn't easy.
Yeah. Well, I'm very, very fortunate that my mother had the foresight of knowing that eventually she was going to have to move out of independent care. And so she herself had already started making those arrangements. So I pretty much just had to come in and go by her, which she still, I mean, sometimes she's too alert for me. But she is still very much in control. And that's another thing, just because someone's in need of your help or, or care, they still don't lose their sense of individuality and their need to still have some control over their lives. And so I'm not a good test case because I have this wonderful mother who already knew this was coming. So we already knew where she was going. The only reason it took 3 weeks is because they had to make sure there was a place for her, and a place opened up. So we were very fortunate, and so now she's just getting settled. And it's a change that's very difficult because she's around all new people, has to get to know all, So I saw a little depression with her in that, and I think it's more of she can see the ending of her life more so than, this was like her last stop, before she dies. But I'm not a good test case on that because I'm one of the fortunate ones in that this happened. In most instances, as I said, when people call our offices, nobody's made plans. Nobody has any money. A family's in a crisis situation. Well, we can't afford to put her in assisted living, the expense of that. We can't afford nursing, but she can't live alone. What do we do? Well, Billy's retired, or so-and-so's not really doing much. She could quit her job. I mean, those are the kind of decisions that people have to make, like, in a hurry. Because if they're in the hospital and coming out, you got to make those decisions. And it's rough. And so that's why there have to be some resources and support mechanisms in place. Now, there are a lot of places, and depending on what state you live in, some are better than others. But it can be very hard to navigate, in addition to dealing with the person who already feels like they're losing control of their life because somebody else is now making decisions for them. Somebody else is telling them, what to, and that's hard. We all can't wait to be adults, so we don't have to listen to our parents anymore. But you can imagine what it's like being an adult, and then your children having to make all the decisions for you. That's tough. That's really tough. So navigating that whole process is very, very difficult. And again, it'd be different if you can immediately go into an assisted living or a nursing home. It doesn't work that way. They're very expensive. If you weren't dual eligible, then People still don't understand that Medicare does not cover long-term care. No matter how we preach it, webinars, workshops, people think, oh, well, I have Medicare, so I'll be okay. They still think that. That is just not the case. So I guess if we all want to do a favor for our parents and grandparents, those are hard discussions that you need to have now so that things can kind of be in place so that when that time comes, that you're ready then to move forward.
Any other questions?
Hi, Thomas Hughes from Bay City News. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The issue of private equity going into nursing homes and other care sectors came up yesterday. I was wondering if you've seen that more in underserved communities, or your thoughts on how that is affecting the industry as a whole.
Private equity for low-income people?
Just flipping, trying to
Oh.
invest in facilities and flip them.
Oh, well, you can't, the law caught up with that. There were people who, I think it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, they changed the law. What would happen is when somebody got sick and they were going to have to move into a nursing home, they'd sell all their assets, or they give all their assets to their children, and then they'd look like they were paupers, and then they were eligible then for all the services, and you could move into those situations. You can't do that anymore. I think it's 5 years that you have to have not had any of those assets. But for poor people who never had any assets or any equity or anything, that's not the issue.
But for owners and operators of
Oh, you mean the owners
care
and the
facilities,
operators?
right.
Okay.
And
So
so
that's
underlying, I wonder,
whole-
like, the average length of ownership of a facility in this zip code versus
Yeah.
the zip code.
I really can't speak to that with any real definite information, but I can tell you that COVID and the pandemic and all the problems that went on, as you well remember, people in nursing homes and that were dying at faster rates. They have had a real workforce problem of recruiting people to work because, as I told you, caregiving is very, very hard work. So there are a lot of issues. So I am really not sure. I just know that I've, read some things on how a lot of nursing homes closed, whether they were forced to because they found out that the quality of care people were receiving was not up to standards, or it just too financially became burdensome for for the owners to maintain the kind of care due to the lack of a workforce that was able to come in. I mean, if you've got one person assigned to 10 people, that's not the kind of care that you would want your loved one to have, particularly if they're immobile. So I'm really not the best person to speak on that private equity part, but I will tell you that the standards for these facilities has to improve because we just saw too many deaths as a result of people not being cared for, that then their immune systems were already compromised, and then something like COVID could come in and just wipe out a complete sector of the population. So,
If there aren't
Thank
any
you.
oh, Marquita.
Hi, I'm Marquita Brown. I'm a freelance writer and editor based in Herndon, Virginia, Northern Virginia. Given your background with Andrew Young as a lawmaker and a lobbyist, you have very unique insight into changing systems and the impact of systems that mow over people of color. And when we're talking about, when you were talking about getting calls from people in crisis situations, people who lack resources, there's a long history and a present reality of systemic racism that fuels that. And so how can you resolve issues that we're discussing about inequitable access to care in this country without also saying the R word and talking about the systemic reasons that exists?
well, first of all, I don't run away from the R word. Racism is uncomfortable for some people, but I don't care. Because if we are going to be a society that succeeds and finds ourselves in a situation where all people can be treated with value, then we need to talk about it. It's not a comfortable conversation for some people. And I say it's uncomfortable for you if you're a racist. If you're not a racist, it should not be uncomfortable. What it should say to you is that, well, then I know that this exists, and so we're going to do everything we can to address disparities, discrimination, and you make that your life's mission. I wish I had all the answers. I don't. All I can do is, again, from the experiences that I had, is take that and try to do what I can to try to change the world I'm in now. And yeah, I don't mind talking about racism. It exists. It's around. We see it. It's systematic. It's institutionalized. And for a people, particularly African Americans, who have given so much to this country, who were in slavery for 400 years, I always try to remind people who don't understand why maybe this community is still a little behind, not a little, but behind in a lot of ways. Think about a baseball game, and for 10 innings, or let's say 9 innings, white people had the bat, the ball, the referees, the umpire, the bases, everything to succeed in the game. And then now in the 10th inning, the last inning, they say, okay, so now we're all equal. We're all fair. It's going to take a while to recover from the damage that was done to us as human beings. All of us, not just black people, but the damage it's done to the way we think, the way we feel about other people, the way we change things. Not look at, well, if they get this, that means I'm losing. The way we attack things like affirmative action was just to give people an opportunity. It wasn't to take away somebody else's opportunity. That's gone. We have to talk about racism. And if we don't talk about it, we'll never address it. We will never change it. And again, if it makes you uncomfortable, then you got to think about why.
You also talked about, politicians of different parties who don't even talk to each other, right? And so again, given the unique position and perspective that you have, are there any positive signs, any green lights that you're seeing that, show any sort of, forward movement, or even examples that we could highlight as journalists about, decision makers, lawmakers, policymakers making real efforts to address the issues of equity and how, that ties into systemic racism?
No.
I'm going to thank you for that, because that was going to be my last question, and so I'd like you to take us out. One of our speakers yesterday was Ajin Poo, who urged us to be positive about possibilities. And so between COVID and the so-called racial reckoning, I wonder if you could perhaps foresee an opportunity that has arisen, or a little bit of leverage that we can gain in talking about intersectionality and the impacts of race, and providing all families with dignity and care. Do you see there's a reason for optimism?
I'm normally a very optimistic person, but I've got to be very honest. Right now, I am not. And all this talk about our democracy under threat, that is a very, very real situation for us. The hatred that was probably always in an underlining that really kind of rose to the top when Barack Obama was elected was just surprising to me, as I thought we had kind of surpassed that. We knew that there was still, that, but I mean, we thought we had passed that. But the visceral hatred that came out of his election and the time he was in office was unreal. Whether you liked his politics or not, I'm talking about just the fact that he was black. Taking no consideration his mama was white, But, and I, never want to get partisan, but here we have someone running for office who's leading his political party that none of us ever would have allowed somebody like Barack Obama to even get to the line, let alone cross it. And there are people who are still vehemently supporting his candidacy with all of the things that we know that are facts, not opinions, but are facts about his character, about what his intentions are. And so, no, I am not optimistic at all right now. But the only thing I can tell you from my perspective is I'm going to still continue to do all I can as long as I have a breath to try to address the change that's needed in this country so that we can all live peacefully, respect the law, and be the best we can be. And until I can't do that anymore, I'll be in long-term care somewhere, but I'll still be trying to change things. So.
You are such an inspiration to me. But I think for the journalists in the room, lots of powerful messages here. We have to, in our work, convey them properly and with contextual background. And Karyne has just given us so much of the tools we need to do that. So let's take this opportunity right now to thank Karyne Jones for joining us.
Thank you. And good luck.